Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about The Mermaid of the Black Conch by Monique Roffey. Have you ever read one of those books that you can fully acknowledge is good, but it just doesn't hit for you? I'm sure that if you read critically, this has happened to you, because not everyone in the world has the same taste. Not all of us have the same experience. Metaphors will not hit for all of us the same way. But if you're reading critically, you can still see the quality of a book. So books can be great and just not be the book for you. That's how this book is for me. And this one was recommended by one of my best friends, so I really wanted to like it. Also, Jasmine, I will not be offended if you just do not watch this one. You have my permission, because I don't want my problems with the book to, you know, affect your love of it. So, The Mermaid of the Black Conch is the story of a man named David Baptiste, who meets a mermaid named Ikaya while out fishing around his home on the island of Black Conch in 1976. She was a young girl in the Caribbean long before any European colonizers arrived, but her beauty attracted all the men on her island, and so attracted the ire of all the women on her island, who cursed her to an eternity in the sea. But soon after David first meets her, Ikaya is caught by two American fishermen while they are competing in a fishing competition. Dragged from the sea, she has to rely on David and a woman named Miss Rain, a reclusive woman who lives in the big house at the top of the hill with her deaf son. And they just hope she can build a life on this small island that is so like and so unlike the one she grew up on and was cursed on. So there's something about this book that reminds me of a round, a song that is repeated over and over, each time picking up another voice, another harmony, another background line. You sort of know the story of this entire book by the end of the first couple of pages, but you know a general story. You basically know the synopsis I just gave you, plus the ending. And you will read the story about a dozen times if you read this book. But each time you get more information, more context, another POV. Eventually it starts moving a little bit more linearly by the end, but even those linear sections and scenes are surrounded by bits of repeating the story. So much so that when we do finally reach the conclusion of the book, there's the falling action and there's not another repetition of the story at the end, I sort of felt thrown. Like, I felt like it was incomplete because I was expecting the story to end with basically another synopsis of the story, and it wasn't there. But the structure of this book itself made it feel a bit more like a poem, which is a bit of a negative for me. I'm not a huge fan of poetry. I crave story. It's what I read for, and even epic poetry that has a story is usually more focused on the vibes, the themes, and the emotions than, like, the beats of a story. I don't need a simple story structure. It doesn't need to be straightforward. I love me some foreshadowing, time jumps, flashbacks, concurrent timelines. But if your story doesn't interest me, and you're not focusing on the story, you're not going to keep my interest. And that was one of the things I did actually like about this book, the story itself. The simple tale of, like, a mermaid being dragged from the sea and falling in love. Like, if it had been told in a more traditional way, I would have loved it. It would have interested me. I love mermaid stories. I love using mermaids as a way to talk about femininity and its connection to nature and the wild. I'm good with doomed romance, though I do prefer not to know it's doomed before the romance even starts. I'm definitely interested in stories that feature pre-Columbian myths and legends. I love stories that dismantle how colonialism affects the world. There's a lot here that should have drawn me in, but the structure kept throwing me back out. And also, there is actual straight-up poetry in this book. Sections are literally poems. I'm not going to talk much about the poetry because, frankly, though I did take literature classes where we read and analyzed poetry, I'm not good at it. I can get it. Like, I understand what the words mean and what it's saying. I can dig in and find the metaphors and the imagery. I'm even proficient at analyzing how the structure helps build meaning, especially when there's more of a story to it. I'm really good at that bits. But even though I can do it, it doesn't really have resonance for me. So like, I can tell you that the poetry is used as a representation of Akaya's voice, and it getting more complex structurally shows us that she is relearning humanity and reconnecting to language and communication. But because the emotional responses that poetry are supposed to give you almost never does for me, or at least not anywhere near the level that prose does, I'm just not interested in an analysis of it. But I do want to talk briefly about why the poetry is here in the first place. So this book has 3 styles of POV. The bulk of the book is just a soft focus, head-hopping, mostly omniscient third person. We jump through pretty much every character in the book's POV, often with little to no signaling that we are switching. And I want to just sidebar, brief tangent here. I've seen several content creators talk about head hopping as somehow intrinsically bad, that it's always a problem, that it's a flaw, and it's not. Like, it's hard to do, and when done poorly, it's very confusing. But head hopping is used in a lot of really good books and is a way of giving you a more complete image of the story. So it's not inherently a flaw. But back to the point, there's also segments that are first person. They are David's journal. They are presented as having been written 40 years after the events of the story and him looking back on the events. Then there's the poetry, which is implied to be Akaya's poetry that she wrote in the ocean and left somewhere for David to read. So they're sort of like love letters-ish, and they're very emotive about the story. But the thing is, I'm not sure why there are these 3 different styles of POV. Like, I know why there are multiple character POV. Like, I understand that. And I understand, like, having a framing device to throw in all the foreshadowing at the beginning. And I even understand the poetry as a separate thing, as a way of giving us Akaya's voice as very separated and very different. But why have both the journals and the soft focus? Especially when, quite often, the journal sections are literally covering the exact same things, the actual scene that was just covered in the soft third person. Like, I'm not sure why we're doing both, except it feels a bit like it was done just to increase the literary cred of the book, which is not something I like to think about books. But one thing I do love about the voice of this book is that it is written in a Caribbean-style English. It uses words, syntax, and grammar that are native to the islands. Now, you may have noticed, I am not native to the Antilles, or anywhere near them. The closest I've ever been is really the 2-week-long trip I took to Belize. And so, yeah, to me, this English sounds like the English I heard in Belize. And I know that the author was born in Trinidad, so my assumption is it's accurate, but I am far from the person to ask if this was a good representation of the region's specific form of English. What I can tell you is that it's a absolutely beautiful form of English as presented in this book. It's easy and smooth to read. It's fun to read and has a lot of musicality, though I do find it slightly easier to read aloud than silently. It does a great job of building the setting. It has a metric shit ton of character to the voice, and does a great job of fighting back against this stupid notion that there is only one correct way to write or speak English. But on the other side of that, alternatively, one of the things that did bother me about this book is I felt like it was insisting on many things as universal that are just not. Like, part of this was the way metaphor and imagery is used in the book. I made a short about one moment in particular that really stood out to me. It's on page 72. That's a weird way of saying it. The daily downpour was a mixed blessing. With the rain, every man and woman felt an old, lingering, hard-to-dissolve guilt for past sins. And that's just really not an association I have with rain. And like, if the author had presented this as some characters feel this way, I would have read on by going, oh, that's an interesting insight to those characters' psychology. But because it was framed as everyone feels this way, I just sort of stopped and stared at it being like, what? Like, what? That's not how I feel. And it's not just that one instance. There are dozens of instances in this book where random images and concepts are framed as universal. That everyone feels this way when they look at the sea. Everyone feels this way when they are looking at these trees. Or universal to just one gender. Like, all men feel this drive. All women feel this drive. And I just don't. Like, those are not universal to me. Maybe I'm weird, but I don't see sex as a life-changing thing. I don't see it as something that would change me from a girl to a woman. Nor do I see love as something that magically transforms a boy into a man. My breasts don't jump with arousal, though that one was not really presented as universal. I just found it fucking funny. But I don't think that men all feel the intrinsic need to piss on everything. And I sure as shit don't believe that every woman intrinsically hates on pretty young girls. And that one was a bit of a deal breaker for me. The crux of this book, the majority of the action, is built on the fact that Akaya was banished by the women of her village just for being attractive enough that men were pursuing her, even though she repeatedly rejected them. And in the modern times of this book, the main protagonist of our story is a woman who hates Akaya because David wants Akaya rather than her. I am more than a little tired of this women hating women, all women are jealous bitches narrative. And also, like, I just don't see it as much in the real world as the media makes it out to be. Like, even in high school, the height of petty drama times, I don't remember a single instance of girls ganging up against this one girl because she happened to be too pretty. It's not something I have ever seen. I've seen plenty of girls bullying other girls. And it's never been about this one girl is too pretty, so we have to shit on her. And these bitches in this book were willing to damn a young girl to an eternity in the sea to keep their men away from her. Even though she was not, like, accepting these men. She was rejecting them. Akaya was already putting an end to the pursuit. And they also banished a random old woman for reasons? Like, I get that it was the author trying to show us that the two things that are unforgivable for a woman is to be too attractive or old. But in my experience, women really don't turn on other women because they have become old. Also, this book has 100% more descriptions of boobs than I ever thought I'd read in a book written by a woman. Also, the fact that Akaya's boobs are described as looking like a young girl's and showing that she was a virgin, yeah, that both made me rather uncomfortable, but it's also just wrong. Like, in case people on the internet out here don't know, a woman's breasts do not magically change because a dick comes into the picture. Like, boobs change because of how much body fat a person has, hormonal changes from puberty, menopause, and pregnancy, or surgery or injury. Like, in general, boobs don't magically change because you had sex. And also, in general, this author seems to think that you can just look at a person and tell, yep, that's a virgin. There's this guy that multiple characters meet and immediately start thinking, oh yes, this virgin. And I'm like, what? Just because a man is quiet, intimidated by women, and likes poetry does not mean he can't have had sex. Plenty of shy, awkward, artistic guys have gotten laid. And you just can't magically tell if someone is a virgin, because sex does not magically change you as a human being. And this is just one of my big pet peeves, so when it kept coming up in this book, I kept being knocked out of the narrative because I was just angry. By the way, there's also just a lot of people being able to guess things about each other that they have no right to know. Pretty much everyone, for example, guesses why Akaya was banished without having been told. They all just jump to the right conclusion immediately, which just furthers the vibes that women hating women for being attractive is a universal truth and therefore the obvious conclusion, which made me even angrier because that's not something that I see as accurate. But in general, there is a lot of people magically knowing things they shouldn't. But the other big thing I want to talk about with this book is something that is not a flaw. It's just something that's contrary to my tastes. In this book, character is clearly secondary importance to theme. It even shows up in the naming convention. Life is a character that disappeared, and when he did so, another character's life basically stopped. So when Life comes back to the island, the author gets to use such clever sentences as, Arcadia's day changed because Life returned. It's clever, it's straightforward, it's clear. That quote I read earlier, that I had so much problem with Rain, about Rain bringing up old feelings of guilt and shame. That quote takes on entirely new meaning when you remember that Rain is also the name of a character, who happens to be the only white woman who lives on the island, who still owns half the island, and who lives with the fact that she is a constant physical reminder of the harms that the slave trade had on the population of the island. There's a police officer whose name is Porthos, and who is a human embodiment of the pathetically corrupt official. Like, this ain't subtle, it's not uncommon, and it works. I have no problems with just, like, having your characters' themes show in their names. What I do not like is the fact that a lot of the times the actions that many of the characters are taking seem to exist solely to support the theme. Like, why does a random guy pee on the mermaid when she's hanging on the dock? I don't know, except that it's a clear metaphor for men claiming women like objects. Why does Miss Rain have peacocks, and specifically a white peacock? IDK, except they are visual symbols for ostentation, and specifically ostentation of white colonial landowners. Why do half the characters keep referring to the mermaid as a fish when she looks and acts entirely like a normal woman, except that her eyes are too shiny and she has webbed hands? I'm not sure, except that the author wanted to discuss dehumanization and its use in the slave trade and misogyny. Why does every male character's dick and balls respond by themselves to the mermaid, even when they are actively thinking of her as an animal rather than a human? I have no fucking idea, except that it's there to insert the idea of sexuality being inherent to the mermaid into our mind, and to make the scenes of violence feel like sexual violence. And, like, I'm all there for themes. I am all for metaphor and deeper meaning. But if the action does not make sense on an emotional and logical level, as well as the thematic and metaphorical, you're gonna lose me. And I felt like about half the shit done in this book is done specifically for the themes. In the end, it's just not the book for me. And to make it worse, I was far more in the mood to read a character and story-driven, action-y, maybe cathartic, but mostly just fun book. And that's not what this is. I was tempted to put it aside for a while, read something else, and come back to it when I was in a better mood for it. But I know me. If I were to set it down, I was not going to pick it back up. And I felt like I should finish this one because it's a good book. I cannot stress to you enough that it is beautifully poetic, elegantly written. It's got a lot to say about female experience. Yes, much of it is stuff I disagree with, but I know it's stuff that is resonant to a lot of women. I love the way the mermaid herself is described. I'm guessing that the scenes of violence against Akaya are deeply cathartic to a lot of people. It's got a distinct, beautiful, challenging voice. My friend loved this book, and I know why. I'm guessing the love story, the imagery of feminine power, the tragedy of Akaya are powerful for her. This just didn't hit for me. Take my complaints with a grain of salt. The themes of this book, themes of women-on-women hatred, themes of female power, themes of love and sexuality, themes of the continuing weight and effect of colonialism, themes of masculine violence. if these themes are things you like in a book, and if you like books that are a bit more poetic and lean more to be about themes and feelings than story, you will likely love this one. It just meant it wasn't the book for me.